Indigenous peoples' perspectives on carbon markets. And then we'll go into our first panel of the day. The first panel is on, apologies. Before that, we will hear from Kimberly Todd, who is a technical specialist, climate and forest team of UNDP on carbon markets and the UNFCCC framework. After we hear from Kimberly, we will go into the first panel discussion of the day, which is on lessons from carbon market projects in Indigenous peoples' territories. And Andrew Davis will moderate this with examples from Tanzania and from Brazil. We will have a brief question and answer session then. Meanwhile, I welcome all of you to put in your questions in the Q&A box. And then we'll move into the second panel discussion, high integrity carbon market standards for forest and opportunities for Indigenous peoples and local communities. That panel will be moderated by Claire Paz Rivera, and we'll see participation from Lucia Madrid, from Our Trees, Daniel Ortega, Mark Enver, Hindu, Maro Ibrahim, and Tuntia Katan, and we'll introduce them specifically right before the panel. We'll then open up for discussion, and we'll have wrap up and final remarks at the conclusion of the event. Thank you so much for being here. I welcome all of you who are here to introduce yourselves in the chat box so we know who's here. And I will now turn the floor to Francisseymour, who is a distinguished senior fellow at the World Resources Institute, for her introductory remarks. Thank you, Francis.
Well, thanks so much, Nina. It's really an honor to be invited to open this important discussion in conjunction with the Permanent Forum. And I'm so impressed to see participants who are staying up very late at night to join this session. As Nina mentioned, I've been asked to reflect briefly on the history of forest carbon finance and maybe say something about the significance of this current moment in that context. I think, like me, many of you have participated in the evolution of REDD+ over the last 15 years, ever since it entered into the UNFCCC negotiations back in Bali in 2007. And from the very beginning, the issue of Indigenous peoples' rights has been central to REDD+ debates. And in fact, back in Bali 15 years ago, no rights, no REDD was the slogan of the protesters there. And in the intervening years, in my view, proponents of Indigenous rights, both at international and national levels, have skillfully used the political space opened up by REDD+ to advance their agendas. Some of the outcomes include international agreement on the Cancun safeguards and the subsequent elaboration of how to operationalize those safeguards in various carbon crediting programs. One of these that you'll hear about later today is the architecture for REDD+ transactions, whose board I chair in my individual capacity. REDD+ readiness activities have also been a vehicle for establishing the norm of free, prior, and informed consent, even if that norm is not always respected in practice. And within specific countries, Indigenous peoples have strengthened their negotiating position by developing maps of their territories, and they can now point to rigorous spatial analysis and research that demonstrates that they are the most effective forest stewards. But the big money that was expected to flow from global carbon markets 15 years ago actually never materialized. And in the meantime, REDD+ finance has been largely constrained by the limits of development assistance budgets and slowed down by the associated bureaucratic hurdles. So the central question about the relationship between forest carbon markets and Indigenous peoples remains largely unanswered because it remains largely untested. That question is as follows. On balance, will markets for forest carbon pose more of a threat to the rights and livelihoods of Indigenous peoples, or will those markets open up new opportunities to advance tenure recognition and to attract the desperately needed finance through getting a financial reward for protecting forests? My sense is that the answer could turn out to be either one of those outcomes, depending on what happens in the coming months, including the results of discussions such as the one we're having today. Why do I think that? Well, over the last year or so, there's been a huge surge of interest in carbon markets in general, and a surge in demand for forest carbon credits in particular. So for the first time in a very long time, the prospect of significant market-based finance for REDD+ seems real. And for a variety of reasons, we are also on the cusp of a transition to market-based demand for forest carbon credits at jurisdictional scale, meaning the scale of entire countries or large subnational jurisdictions such as states or provinces, as was envisioned in the outcome of the UNFCCC negotiations, rather than just crediting at the scale of small projects. And for me, that's significant because when governments are the ones issuing forest carbon credits, they are the ones accountable for ensuring that high standards of environmental and social integrity are met. Those standards include ensuring the rights to forest land and forest carbon, ensuring that affected stakeholders have the opportunity for full and effective participation in any interventions designed to generate credits, and that those stakeholders can claim an equitable share of any resulting revenues. These standards, in turn, provide an opening for leaders of Indigenous territories to ensure that they have a seat at the table to assert their rights, but not only in a defensive posture. They are also in a position to position themselves as co-designers and co-implementers of any strategies to protect and restore forests, and again, to demand an equitable share of the benefits of any forest carbon transactions. But clearly, in order to take advantage of that opening, Indigenous leaders need to have access to good information about these various standards and processes that are involved in forest carbon crediting and market transactions. And they also need access to independent analysis so that they know what options are available to them, have the capacity to select the option that's in their best interest, including the option of opting out of carbon markets altogether if that is their choice. We've got a lot of work to do to level the playing field between prospective buyers of forest carbon credits, prospective sellers of those credits, and all the other stakeholders that are implicated in prospective forest carbon market transactions. And that's why today's session is so important. And it's wonderful to see the lineup of very capable speakers and moderators who have expertise, experience, and unique perspectives to be shared over the next 2 hours. I'll just close by thanking the hosts of today's session and all the various speakers lined up to follow for making a good start on that objective of leveling the playing field and identifying the gaps that we still need to address. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your remarks, Francis. Really appreciate that. I now want to pass the floor to Jennifer Tauli-Corpus, who is from the Igorot peoples of the Mountain Province in the Philippines and calling from her traditional territory right now. And Jennifer is also the Global Policy and Advocacy Lead for Neotero. Jing, thank you so much for being here with us at this late hour for you. And you have the floor.
Thank you, Nina. I acknowledge the traditional owners of the territory where I am located right now, the ancestral domain of the Ibaloy Igorot people, which is just outside what is now known as Baguio City. I am about 100 miles actually from my ancestral domain, the ancestral domain of the Kankanai Igorot Indigenous Peoples of Basao Mountain Province. To help you visualize where I am from, you can look at my background, which is an actual recent photo of my hometown taken last year. So, various scientific studies and assessments published recently, both in relation to climate change and to biodiversity, highlight the urgency of the crisis. Indigenous peoples who live very closely with nature feel the impacts of climate change and biodiversity loss very keenly. In the country where I live, we experience intense storms, In other places, droughts, and all over the world, rising temperatures. The good news is that these studies also recognize that Indigenous peoples are important partners in addressing both the climate and biodiversity crises, and that ensuring secure tenure of Indigenous peoples is an important pathway towards accelerating climate and biodiversity action. Francis mentioned the surging interest in carbon credits and rightly pointed out that this is causing worry among Indigenous peoples, and because the intense pressure on Indigenous territories has the possibility of resulting in displacement and rights violations. The adoption of Article 6 decisions, the 3 decisions at COP26 last year in Glasgow, which includes language on Indigenous peoples' rights in both the preambular and operational texts of the 3 decisions, is a step in the right direction. The other standards, which include safeguards on Indigenous peoples, are also steps in the right direction. However, Francis has rightly highlighted that Indigenous peoples have had diverse views, positions, and experiences and contexts on REDD+ and carbon markets since negotiations on these issues began. Some Indigenous peoples are against putting a price tag on carbon, which is viewed as commodification of nature and not consistent with Indigenous cosmovisions and the view that all beings, human and non-human living beings in territories, as well as the non-living components and the spirits, should not be commercialized. Others object to the carbon market because of the worry that the option to purchase carbon credits would eliminate the need to cut emissions at source. And Indigenous peoples do not want to be part of greenwashing carbon emitting businesses. However, Indigenous peoples also recognize the potential of incentivizing forests and recognize that done right, these incentives could help towards securing tenure of Indigenous peoples, as well as provide resources for Indigenous peoples to continue what we have been doing since time immemorial, which is protection of territory. I would like also to pick up on one of the main points on the need for high integrity carbon credits. Sometimes we get lost in talking about the technical side of how carbon credits could be considered as high integrity. And we frequently forget that high integrity also includes respect for safeguards for Indigenous people's rights. And this is particularly tricky when talking about jurisdictional approaches. So currently, I serve on the Indigenous Advisory Panel for the Lowering Emissions by Accelerating Forest Finance Coalition, the LEAF Coalition. And one of the main issues that we have had to advise on is how to make sure that Indigenous peoples are not left behind and how to make sure that the safeguards are observed. And one of the barriers that we run against is the notion that, that the safeguards would depend on national circumstances and national legislation. So it's important to make sure that these safeguards are global, and that whenever based on global operational definitions, there are Indigenous peoples in the territory that is going to be covered by in the jurisdictional approach, then it's important that Indigenous rights are respected whether or not there is national legislation recognizing Indigenous peoples. And this is particularly important here in Asia and in Africa, where a lot of Indigenous peoples' rights are not recognized. So that is one of the main points I would like to make. When we talk about high integrity carbon credits, it's important to recognize free, prior, and informed consent, as well as securing the importance of tenure for Indigenous peoples. And this is important because it's urgent to protect the forest through many different means, including through private sector finances. So what do we need to do to ensure that high integrity carbon credits include the notion of protection of Indigenous peoples' rights? First of all, I already said that we recognize that these standards are global and should not be dependent on the local legislation or national circumstances. It's also extremely important to make sure that Indigenous peoples are able to participate in all of these the discussions on carbon credits and applications of jurisdictions to be included in programs that in carbon market programs. It's also crucial that capacities of Indigenous peoples are built so that all of the benefits from engaging in carbon markets are able to trickle down, or in fact are able to benefit directly the Indigenous peoples. Now, one remaining concern, one of the concerns, I should say, of Indigenous peoples is that engagement in carbon markets is highly technical, and many Indigenous peoples do not necessarily have the technical skills. I would say, however, that there are good practices that everyone could learn from on the ground. And I would like, in closing, to highlight the experience of one of the partners of Niatero in Australia. And this is in relation to cultural burning, which is practice which has been practiced by the Australian Aboriginal people since time immemorial. And the theory is that cool burns during before the dry season would prevent huge wildfires during the dry season. And they have partnered with universities and scientists to prove exactly how much emissions are avoided by their cultural burning practices. And in this way, they were able to benefit directly from the credits generated by their cultural burning activities. I think this is a model that needs to be replicated everywhere, full partnership with Indigenous peoples, and in the case of jurisdictional approaches, the possibility of sub-agreements with Indigenous peoples, or I should say not the possibility, the requirement for sub-agreements between the jurisdictions applying for credits, applying to be part of the credit system, and Indigenous peoples within the territory. So there are good practices that can be emulated, and this is part of making sure that safeguards are followed and that safeguards remain part of the conversation around ensuring high integrity for carbon credits. I will end here, and thank you very much for this time to express the divergent or the diverse views of Indigenous peoples. Back to you, Nina.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jing, for such thought-provoking presentation. We heard you loud and clear. Thank you for mentioning free, prior, and informed consent, tenure, rights for Indigenous peoples, global standards versus national, ensuring that safeguards remain part of the discussion, and Indigenous peoples are directly involved in all carbon market discussions and the need for capacity building. Thank you so much. This is really useful. And I wanted to thank Francisseymour as well for laying the ground so well on where we are now and how we got here. Thank you so much. I now wanted to pass the floor to my colleague, Kimberly Todd. She's the technical specialist here at the Climate and Forest Program. And Kimberly will give us a presentation on carbon markets and the UNFCCC framework. And thank you so much, Kimberly. The floor is yours.
Hi, colleagues. It's great to be with you all, and thanks so much to Francis and Jing for the excellent start to this discussion. So I've been asked to provide an overview of carbon finance in the context of the Paris Agreement. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on 5 key topics, just provide a brief overview of carbon markets, and then provide the structuring of Article 6 in the Paris Agreement, just to provide an overview of the main components of Article 6, and in particular, the key decisions taken most recently in Glasgow, COP26, to finalize the rule book for Article 6. And then I will also touch on voluntary carbon markets and integrity in carbon markets, which is a key theme that has already been raised. So we'll talk a bit more about that as well. Next slide, please. So going back to the essentials, just to have all on the same page. So we're talking about carbon markets. What are carbon markets? So essentially we have a market, and that's where we have buying and selling. So we have trading of a unit that is carbon based, right? So we have units in carbon dioxide equivalents that are being bought and sold. There are both allowances or permits that allow an entity to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide equivalents. Then there are also carbon credits, which represent 1 ton of mitigation achieved, essentially. So 1 ton of carbon CO2 equivalents reduced, sequestered, or avoided. So this is essentially what we're talking about when we speak about carbon markets. Next slide, please. And then there are two main types of carbon markets to be aware of. So we're going to speak about both of them in the event today. So we have compliance markets, and this is where there is regulation or policy that requires companies or governments, in the case of, for example, the EU emissions trading scheme, to reduce emissions. So there's a legal basis for having to meet those emission reduction requirements. And the market may be used either through the purchase of those, the use of those allowances or permits, as well as carbon credits or offsets to meet those regulatory requirements. So those are compliance markets. On the voluntary carbon market side, we have, in particular, private sector companies, but individuals as well, who for various voluntary climate-related commitments or goals wish to purchase carbon credits to help meet those goals in terms of carbon neutrality, net zero targets, on an individual basis to offset their travel, for example. So there are a variety of purposes there, but predominantly it's about companies looking to voluntarily reduce their emissions. Next slide, please. And just to say, before we get into, why is this discussion around carbon markets important, just to say that carbon markets are not new, though the Paris Agreement puts into place this sort of new context and establishes the role of carbon markets within the overall Paris Agreement framework, and in that new context. Carbon markets have been around both on the compliance as well as voluntary side for some time. We've had international carbon trading going back to 1997 in the context of the Kyoto Protocol, and the prime sort of compliance carbon market there that the global community has experience with is the Clean Development Mechanism, right? So now we're moving into this Article 6 context. But we have experience, and certainly lessons learned, and certainly challenges that have been faced in carbon markets in the past, that as we move forward in terms of design and these next phases with Article 6 as well as voluntary carbon markets, these issues can be at the forefront and can be addressed. So why are carbon markets important? They are a tool that, with the intent to create an economic incentive for climate mitigation, right? So reducing, ensuring that there can be additional climate mitigation because of this cost-effective tool in the form of carbon markets. So that's the intent, that it will reduce carbon emissions, accelerate a transition to low carbon and climate resilient development in this cost-effective way. And additionally, that it can allow a broad base of stakeholders, stakeholder groups to contribute to climate action, right? That it's not only governments, but international organizations, corporations, and people to participate in climate action. So these are sort of the positive goals around carbon markets, but as has already been mentioned, there are certainly concerns on doing it well, making sure they're well designed and done right to ensure the reductions are real and we're not trading what's been called hot air in the past, or that corporations are engaging in sort of greenwashing and concerns around not actually meeting their sort of internal reduction targets. So these are concerns, and again, it's as has been mentioned in terms of safeguards and the integrity aspects, the potential to ensure carbon markets can have a positive impact overall are really dependent on robust design and the governance of those markets. Next slide, please. So it was really critical, given a number of these concerns and some of the experiences in the past, to make sure Article 6 can get it right. So when we're speaking about the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change context. And so now I'll focus a bit on the Paris Agreement and what is known as the Paris Rulebook, and to see how carbon markets are treated in this new global context. Next slide. Thanks. So the Paris Agreement is essentially built on nationally determined contributions. That's the backbone of the Paris Agreement. So this is where each country is putting forward a climate action plan to cut emissions as well as adapt to climate impacts. So each party to the Paris Agreement is required to establish such a nationally determined contribution, or NDC, and update it every 5 years. And what's interesting to note is that 85% of the most recent NDCs, the new or updated NDCs that have been submitted in 2020 and 2021, flag the intent to use international market mechanisms to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So essentially, the interest is there from the majority of countries putting forward their NDCs to engage in these market mechanisms in some way. So given that expected scale and that expected interest, it's critical to make sure these are operationalized and put into place in a robust way, as we said, ensuring integrity. Next slide, please. So we have the NDCs. We know that a lot of those NDCs recognize that there will be interest in using these Article 6 sort of approaches, or carbon markets more broadly. So what is Article 6? Article 6 then recognizes that countries, as they're implementing their nationally determined contributions, they may wish to cooperate in some ways. And so this is where it opens up a form of cooperation through carbon markets in Article 6. But just to mention that Article 6 also addresses the non-market approaches as well. So it's a sort of balance. A balance was sought here to open the door to those countries who are interested in pursuing carbon markets as well as non-market approaches. And the overall goal of Article 6 is important. The phrasing around ensuring overall ambition, promoting sustainable development, and environmental integrity are key. So this allows, so countries can cooperate and engage in transfers of what are called internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, or ITMOs, where the mitigation is achieved in one country and that is sold, and it essentially counts towards the other country's NDC. There's also a new specific market mechanism established under the UNFCCC under the 6.4 piece, and then again the non-market approaches. So, next slide, please. And to come to agreement on the specific rules on how this would be rolled out, it was agreed. It was difficult to find agreement. So there were several COPs there, climate change conferences, where these difficult political and technical issues on how this would really work could not be resolved. But finally, that was unlocked and resolved at COP26 in Glasgow. Next slide, please. And there were a number of key issues, technical and policy related issues that were agreed. We're not going into detail, of course, just flagging a few of those elements. How to ensure that overall mitigation of global emissions, that Article 6 is really contributing to enhance mitigation overall. Avoiding double counting. So this is key to the integrity question, ensuring there's a tool, which is referred to as corresponding adjustment, that ensures there is not double counting of emissions in more than one country. And then finally, rules on treatment of the clean development mechanism. So I think maybe if we can skip the next slide and go 2 slides ahead. I know we're limited on time. Just to mention a few key entry points, and Jing had already mentioned these in her comments. So just to provide a bit more on that, it was considered a very positive element of the Article 6 outcome. Some of these specific entry points, these specific inclusions in the text that relate to Indigenous peoples and local communities. So as countries engage on these cooperative approaches, the trading of ITMOs and so on, they must report on how rights are respected, promoted, and considered. And you can see the full text there. So explicit reference, and it's a reporting requirement for countries to do that. Then under the Article 6.4 mechanism, it refers specifically to subnational, local, and where appropriate, subnational stakeholder consultation on any activity design for Article 6.4. That's a requirement. The supervisory body, which will oversee this Article 6.4 mechanism, is requested to engage with the local community and Indigenous peoples platform and its facilitative working group. So that's another key entry point to ensure through that platform that inputs are brought to 6.4. Another key role is ensuring robust social and environmental safeguards under 6.4, and the supervisory body will develop those. And then stakeholders, this specific reference to having an independent grievance process was also referenced in the 6.4 decision. Next slide, please. And then looking ahead, there is more work to do, further guidance to be developed to elaborate some of the details for the full operationalization of these aspects of Article 6. And as mentioned already, in particular, this process moving forward to apply robust social environmental safeguards will be really critical. Next slide. I don't think, it looks like we're limited on time, so we can probably quickly just go through. You'll be hearing from some of the voluntary carbon markets standards. So I don't know that I need to go through this in great detail, but just to again go back to the distinction here that voluntary carbon markets are transacting carbon credits that are not purchased to meet mandatory obligations, but rather voluntary. And these transactions are aligned to various international standards. And you'll be hearing more about this. If we can go 2 more slides ahead, I can just show a figure that shows what Francis was referring to earlier in this surge of interest in the markets. and particularly for the forest and land use sector. So this is very clear on this slide to see this dramatic increase, in particular the blue line for the forest and land use sector. These are voluntary carbon market transactions, and you can see an increase from 2019 to 2020, and then an even that surge, that acceleration from 2020 onward. So that's very useful to see. And if we could just skip ahead 3 more slides, maybe, and I can wrap up. Go ahead. And just to flag some of the key integrity points that hopefully we'll be coming back to more in the discussion. Integrity looks at both the supply side. So what is the integrity of the underlying integrity of the carbon credit that is being transacted, as well as the demand side. Is the company, for example, that's purchasing that credit, is it in the context of a science-aligned target? Is that company carrying out internal reductions sufficiently, and so on? So we have both the supply and demand side, which we'll be hearing more about, and just to flag a few of the elements that this integrity question is not just around the technical side, the carbon side, are the emission reductions real, but also the social and environmental dimensions, the rights issues, and so on. So that broader perspective on integrity will be critical as we move forward with the design and implementation of carbon markets. I think that is all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kimberly. Excellent presentation. I wanted to say to the participants, we know this is a lot of information technical. We have the presentation available, translated in languages. We are happy to share it afterwards. And of course, the recording will be shared with all participants. I wanted to now move to our next panel. And this is the lessons from current carbon market projects in Indigenous Peoples territories. This will be moderated by Andrew Davis, who is a consultant with the Climate and Land Use Alliance. Welcome, Andrew. And our 2 panelists are Isaac Bryson from the Yaeda Project, who is a Yaeda Valley project manager and community member in Tanzania. And I wanted to also congratulate them because the Yaeda Project won the Equator Prize, the UNDP Equator Prize in 2019 for this work. So we're happy to have you here and hear from you. And we welcome also Chief Amir Surui, who is the leader of the Paiter Surui peoples and the general coordinator of the Metarelia Association in Brazil. Welcome, and Andrew, you have the floor with your panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nina. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this panel. I'm very excited to talk and hear from our panelists today that Nina has introduced for us. We've heard a little bit about the international context and international trends. And now we are going to hear about specific projects that are actually operating now, how they've navigated both the risks and challenges of carbon markets, how those projects relate to rights and livelihoods on the ground, and how they relate to the changing governance conditions in the real world. So I'm thrilled to be joined here by Isaac and Amir, as Nina mentioned. So without further ado, I'll pass the floor to Isaac. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you to all. I'm happy to join you this evening at Tanzania. It is evening time. Okay, as already mentioned, my name is Isaac Preson. I come from Yaeda Valley, but I'm a project manager for Yaeda EAC project. And in short, what's wrong? My God.
Looks like we've lost connection there. If he doesn't connect within a few moments, perhaps we'll just change the order of the presentations. And I'll just add for our participants, please, we will have a brief question and answer session after these presentations. So please leave those in the Q&A section in the Zoom platform. Doesn't look like he's connected. Amir, would you like to go ahead and start, please? And we'll pick up with Isaac in a moment.
Sim, posso sim. Estou aqui à disposição.
Wonderful. Thank you.
All right, I can start as soon as you want me.
Então, primeiramente,
So,
quero agradecer
firstly, I would like to thank the invitation.
muito importante.
It is really important to have this panel,
Fala sobre
and it speaks about experiences of the indigenous people about carbon markets. So, on behalf of the Surui people from the state of Rondônia in Brazil, I would like to say that
somos muito felizes
we're really
queria mostrar
fortunate
que o projeto
because we're happy because when we wanted to show the world that the project Carbono was a mechanism to fight climate change and bring respect to the environment and improve as well social issues of those who live in the forest. So when we try to do that, unfortunately, the challenge was really big because it doesn't depend only on those who are thinking about the project, but also depends on all the system, mainly politics. And when we were debating the importance of this project, people understood that people thought we were selling the forest, but it's not that. We are actually proposing that some mechanisms should be implemented to respect the forest, ensuring that people know how to use the forest and understand the important role in the mid and the long term. So this is basically what the Paete people was trying to do. But currently I know that people are talking about politics. I mean, politicians, they talk a lot, but they do very little. So we've been debating this for a long time, sustainability mechanisms or carbon itself, trying to lower and find an equilibrium of the emissions. And then we have to talk about the equilibrium of the planet, the economic awareness, using our knowledge, both biological or whatever else is important, but never actually we do what should be done. So currently I do believe that, and I do hope that indeed we have the conditions and capacity to implement the agreements that are created currently, like the Paris Agreement and other agreements. So the project Surui currently does not really work, but it was an experience that brought, let's say, it showed the world how it is possible to develop projects with indigenous peoples. But unfortunately, there is another side to the story, because people think that indigenous peoples do not have autonomy in the sense of having governance of their projects. And by the way, we were attacked many times because the territory, the indigenous territory, is considered as something that is collective. So a lot of people were, the system made it very difficult for us because some people used fake information saying that we were selling the environment, that we were creating, we were doing damage in the sense of the collective right of our people, and that was not true. But our project Carbono from the Surui people is still focused on its ideology of bringing better quality not only for the Soroi people, but to Brazil as a whole, more to the region. So keeping in mind the environment and the forest that is being threatened in Brazil. So there are some big projects from the government, such as mining in indigenous people or dealing with the agribusiness in indigenous territories. So by the way, we are going through a very difficult situation with the indigenous people, Yanomami, that is being destroyed. Yanomami people is being destroyed by mining companies. So we asked for help for the Yanomami people so that the public audience could actually help us solve this kind of problem. The public opinion, we need the support. So I think Brazil is in Brazil, there's always people that do not want these kind of projects to advance, but they don't want projects like ours to advance. They actually say that taking care of the environment, we're going to stop development. But definitely for us indigenous people, that is not true. That's not the case. But the Project Carbono Soroi is an experience, an excellent experience that now can demonstrate that it is possible to develop things within indigenous people territories with a governance system that is transparent and with the participation of all. Thank you. If you have any questions, please, you can ask me during the debate.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Amir. If I could, I would just like to follow up with a quick question. You mentioned the dynamics of both the misconceptions of red, but also the dynamics of mining. And it's my understanding that it's the combination of those two that directly led to the discontinuation of the project. Is that right? Or could you clarify why the project is no longer currently operating?
Firstly, because deforestation was greater than what we had foreseen. That happened because there was no political support in terms of the oversight of deforestation, trying to fight it, because the government has the authority to stop that. We indigenous people, we don't have this autonomy. We cannot work as policemen, but deforestation, we needed to have some autonomy to stop the deforestation. Secondly, there were some positions that were not the bona fide, trying to divide us, our people, so that they can say that our system, our governance system of the carbon projects was not engaging everyone, which is not true. This is what they said, but it's not true. And they tried to corrupt indigenous leaderships so that they tried to divide us. So that's what happened. So we need that when we have new projects, we have to have this institutional governmental responsibility to help fight deforestation, for example. And also, the second topic I would like to say is to respect the autonomy of the indigenous people within the governance system and in its projects. That's what did not happen. So that didn't help, and that didn't happen, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Chief Amir. It really underscores the very serious conditions that indigenous peoples are facing everywhere, I think, and how these projects evolve. I think it's very instructive. Thank you. We're going to go now to our second presentation. Isaac, the floor is yours.
Okay, once again, I'm sorry there was a problem with the network, but now we are good. Once again, my name is Isaac Bryson. My name is Isaac Bryson. Yeah, I am a project manager for UNDP. Let me start directly by introduction of our project, that this is like other ready project, is a community ready project, which aim to reduce emission from deforestation while supporting the development of these indigenous communities and conservation of their natural habitat. We are working in partnership with Carbon Tanzania that played a key role on all technical issues. As already said, that the indigenous, we are not good in technical issues, but we are working together with Carbon Tanzania to make we reach the goal that we have decided. Yeah, the project with associate revenue, it supports the anti-poaching programs, the monitoring programs, the education programs, the health programs, and all other programs related to the community. This project, it supports the community around 61,000 population of the community. Most of them, they came from the hunter and gatherers, the Hazabe. I think most of the people, they know them. And we have other community who are the local pure pastoralists, the Datoga. And also we have other few tribes who are living together with these tribes. So we have a contract of 12 villages, and up to date, we have managed to have an area for the project of around 110,000 hectare, and the finance which has been dispersed up to date is USD dollars 652,000 and 382. Yeah, trees that have been prevented from the cut. Yeah, it is around 171,700 trees. Yeah, that is an introduction. Then from the whole period that we have run the project up to date, there are several lessons that we have learned from this project. The first one is the land tenure issue. Yeah, the CCRO, or community customer right of occupants, has been recognized as the foundation for the project. This CCRO also have defended the project and has shown that the project can last for a longer. Also, another is cultural identity. From this project, the project have helped to strengthen the cultural lifestyle of the hunter and gatherers, as well as those pure local pastoralists, because their life is directly connected to the nature. So conserving the natural forest through this project have strengthened the cultural lifestyle. Also, yeah, the project through this cultural identity, we have seen now the cultural identity have been shaped by this project, and we believe that the project can last for a longer, because this culture depends directly on nature, and the nature we are talking about is the conserving natural forestry that is directly reducing the emission. So we believe the emission cannot stop. We cannot be stopped by this community, can be forever maybe. And another lesson is partnership. Through this project, we have recognized the partnership of different stakeholders. We have our own our own government stakeholders from the community level. We have ward and district. They have been giving us support in running this project, especially leadership issues. And also we have other stakeholders who help us in technical issues, as I mentioned, Carbon Tanzania. They help us in finding voluntary market guys who can purchase our offsets. They help us in finding verification programs or organizations that can verify our project, and we proceed well. And recently we have verified the project through Plan Vivo, Global Easter, Epic Sustainability. Yeah. And also they are helping us in finding the markets. Yeah? And also bring revenue back. After finding the market, they find the revenue, then they bring the revenue back, and also sharing different information that is very important for the indigenous community to understand their project. Okay, another issue that is land is an issue of finance. Yeah, we have seen that community have engaged in biannual meeting. We used to make a biannual meeting announcement for revenue. So through these meetings, the community have engaged in participatory discussions about how to utilize their revenue on best ways that they have been recognized themselves. Another issue is transparency. This project we have recognized this project as a transparent project than other projects, I can say, because we have seen Carbon Tanzania coming to announce the project, the revenue that have been obtained from different customers, voluntary customers from outside and inside of our country, and also monitoring issues. The community have been engaged themselves in making monitoring of the project, while the carbon is supporting technical issue and the flow of the information from community to the Carbon Tanzania and other stakeholders is like a transparency issue. So we are happy for that. And lastly,
Isaac, I'm so sorry. I have to play the bad guy here. We are close on time. If we could just
okay, thank you. And lastly, I can say that this project have brought a benefit sharing mechanism that have been decentralized to the level of the community. So we can see that the direct beneficiary who are at the level of the community have recognized this project that it brings support to them. So we are happy for that because it is directly benefiting the community rather than just coming to those higher leaders. No, the money is flowing directly to those hunter gatherers as well as the Toga, and they're happy for this project. And myself, I'm happy, and this is a great day to join you in UNDP. I'm happy for that.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Such an inspiring experience. Congratulations on all the progress. And I'm so sorry I had to cut that. I'm sure there's much more we could talk about, and we will continue talking in the next sessions.
Okay.
I do want to highlight one question that was made that perhaps can be taken up in a subsequent section. That has to do with elaborating on the benefit sharing mechanism of the project, how many stakeholders are included in the mechanism, and whether the benefits are monetary or non-monetary. But I think that's something perhaps we'll take up in the subsequent section. Thank you so much, Chief Amir, and to Isaac. And with this, I'll pass the floor to Clea Paz Rivera for the next section.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, Chief Amir, Isaac. This was a very interesting session and discussion, and I think we all are left with wishes to hear more. Hopefully, we will have more opportunities to have exchanges on lessons learned. But we have now to transition to this next panel. So I will invite my distinguished panelists to please turn on your cameras. Lucia, Daniel, Mark, Hindu, and Tuntiak. And I'm very honored. My name is Clea Paz Rivera. I work in UNDP's Climate and Forest Program, supporting the Forest Declaration platform, as well as the high integrity, our engagement with high integrity voluntary carbon market initiatives. And I'm very pleased to introduce you to this panel that is going to focus on high integrity initiatives and standards and the opportunities these present for Indigenous peoples. I'm honored to be joined by a very distinguished panel. that I'm going to introduce now. Lucia Madrid is a senior policy manager for the Architecture for RED Plus Transactions Art Secretariat. She will be presenting in Spanish. I have Daniel Ortega, co-chair of the expert panel of the Integrity Council on Voluntary Carbon Markets, ICBCM. Mark Kember, co-executive director of external affairs for the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. And my dear friend Hindu, Omaru Ibrahim, member of the Mboro Pastoralist People in Chad and president of the Association of Indigenous Women and Peoples of Chad. And Tuntiak, my dear friend Tuntiak Katang, member of the Shuar people, vice coordinator of the coordinator of indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin, COICA, who will be also presenting in Spanish. We're going to start this panel by hearing from the initiatives, these 3 initiatives that are promoting high integrity carbon markets. And I'm going to ask my panelists to respond to 2 questions. And we're going to go in the order that I have introduced you. The questions are, how can indigenous peoples engage and benefit in the initiatives you are working on? And the second question is, how will your initiatives will ensure that the perspectives and experience of indigenous peoples are incorporated in the intended outcomes of the initiatives? So we start with Lucia. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity to participate, UNDP, to all the participants for this presentation to present in relation to art and the tree standard. Next slide, please. Art means architecture for transactions related to RED+. We're a team that created a standard to certify carbon for the reduction of mitigation, RED at the country level and later at subnational level. So it secures that the standard is being used correctly, and it also creates a registry to store, cancel, and work on this and the carbon and the emissions. And tree allows us to do that, precisely that, to measure it, establish social, legal, economic standards to generate carbon bonds that could be sold in the market. Who participate? Governments, national, subnational, who hire an external verifier, which is, this is controlled by art. And then you have tree credit buyers. It could be countries that do so under the Paris Agreement, different companies, private individuals. This is a fully independent organization from buyers. So we decide, or the producers decide who they sell, who they buy from, and so forth. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. As we mentioned, this is jurisdictional based. So it's based on initiatives by national or subnational, that is to say provinces, states, and so forth, with the purpose of generating public policy that are needed to face the challenges in terms of deforestation, land tenure rights, modifying law incentives, doing better monitoring, things that governments may develop. When RED+ is proposed, or a RED+ policy is created by a country, then it could affect 100% of the national territory, or you can do a subnational region only, a jurisdiction or more within a nation, national territory, or more or 2 indigenous peoples' territories. Next slide, please. Answering the first question, how to guarantee that indigenous perspectives and experiences are incorporated in these activities? Well, all RED+ activities must be carried out following the Cancun safeguards. So there won't be any emission without having an independent body validate, verify that the safeguards are being fulfilled. Safeguards are complementary of each other. They include the rights of indigenous peoples, the respect of the indigenous knowledge with full and effective participation by indigenous peoples with transparency. Next slide, please. The following question is, how do indigenous peoples get involved and can benefit from the said mechanisms? Well, we have 3 ways in which they can participate and several in relation to benefits to indigenous peoples and local territories. First, it's to create a subnational proposal with a national government and indigenous peoples and jurisdictions to work explicitly on this. As part of this option, they can let the government or agree with the government. So to indigenous peoples, the benefits that belong to them must be reached by them. So must get to them. Second is to develop activities that support jurisdictional efforts as part of a national, subnational accounting area. Now, this may be done with or without carbon property as part of what's recognized by law. Indigenous peoples' activities that support this program may receive several benefits, which could be economic or not economic in nature. Third is to develop activities that support jurisdictional efforts as one that is an independently monitored project. This can create credits through other standards, could be done nested through remotion or the creation. And sorry, next slide, please. Lastly, well, about benefit sharing, well, there's some options. The way in which this is carried out and the way the indigenous peoples participate, it must be agreed by all key parties. And this has to be done through projects that fulfill all the safeguards. Among those, participation, inclusion, justice, among others that are included as part of the tree's safeguards. The most common options in terms of IPs and local communities and other actors to be part of are: 1, to make sure that the credits are received so that then can sell them independently afterwards. Second would be to receive not the credits, but the income from the selling of the consolidated sale of the tree's credits. A third way would be environmental service payments or other incentives which are not related to carbon credits. And the last one would be non-monetary benefits, things that the indigenous peoples may want to negotiate, such as land titling and other means. Next slide, please. And that is all. And I hope I was able to stay within the 5 minutes that I was assigned. Thank you all very much. I'll answer any questions you may have. And also at your disposal is my email address on the screen and other information we can share with you through the UN. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Lucia. I think that was very comprehensive, and I'm sorry that we have such a short time, but there's so much to talk about in this session. I'm going to turn now to Daniel, who's going to talk about what ICBCM is doing. The floor is yours, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Clea. Buenos días con todos. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to UNDP for inviting us. I'm gonna try to be very concise, recognizing the importance of this fora. Let us first say at the outset and recognize that the voluntary carbon market has not delivered consistently for indigenous peoples and local communities. While the voluntary carbon market is a key complementary tool to accelerate a just transition to 1.5 degree, it will only succeed if it is rooted in high integrity. The purpose of the Integrity Council of the Voluntary Carbon Market that I'm proud to represent in this forum is to help build consistently high integrity to help ensure the voluntary carbon market delivers on that objective. And that means that we need to ensure equitable outcomes for Indigenous peoples and local communities. Well, how the voluntary carbon market can help Indigenous peoples? It is important first and foremost to recognize that the voluntary carbon market is not a primary solution for fighting climate change. It cannot replace robust policy and rigorous international decarbonization of the corporate sector and government efforts. High quality carbon credits, though, can channel finance towards genuine and additional greenhouse reductions and removals that go beyond what can otherwise be achieved. It should efficiently mobilize additional finance towards urgent mitigation and climate resilient development. It should also protect and promote nature and biodiversity, delivering adaptation and conservation benefits, and it should deliver also sustainable development co-benefits. To do this, the voluntary carbon market needs to support the protection of IPLC rights and resources, and as absolute minimum, it must have the appropriate safeguards in place to ensure it is not doing any harm to the people on the ground and at the front lines of the climate crisis. And that means that we need to co-create, collaborate, work together, the frameworks to ensure consistently high integrity with IPLCs. There is a mantra that I keep repeating myself and my colleagues at the ICBCMS that we have learned from our engagements in the past. There should be nothing for Indigenous people and local communities without real participation and engagement of the communities. So what does high integrity mean for the voluntary carbon market? There are essentially three pillars to this. First, it means knowing credits are doing what they say they are doing because there is a definitive global threshold standard for high quality carbon credits. Two, it means transparency and confidence because high quality credits are trading in a market base on a rigorous standards and infrastructure where accountability is of the essence. And three, it means buyers are making legitimate claims using credits as a part of the credible net zero pathway. The Integrity Council, therefore, focuses on the first two of these two pillars, and we are also working closely to other key players, including the voluntary carbon market that Mark will share more about, who are leading efforts on the third pillar. What we are trying to do is to set up, the Integrity Council was set up in September 2021 as an independent governance body. Our purpose is to ensure that the voluntary carbon market accelerates a just transition. Again, we recognize the voluntary carbon market doesn't currently deliver consistently for IPLCs or contribute to a just transition as effectively as it could. Our theory of change is therefore very simple. If we build integrity first, a scale will follow. And that scale is of critical importance as we are going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement and support the Sustainable Development Goals. Therefore, a central part of our work and one of the most immediate priorities is to develop our core carbon principles as a threshold standard of quality and integrity, and the assessment framework, which is a tool that we will use to understand where each of the current carbon credit programs stands. This will be established a high quality carbon credit threshold standard, providing guidance on how to apply the CCPs and define which carbon crediting programs and methodology types could be eligible. We are currently developing these frameworks, and we want to ensure your voices, the voices and concerns of the IPLCs are reflected from the design stage and are embedded into all key decision-making points. We recognize this is not a silver bullet, and we have to be realistic that this will be an ongoing process. Perhaps at the first time, we will not make it right, but we are striving to achieve that success and learn from you on your most concerns. Building on the notion that communities can be thought of as not only stakeholders, but shareholders, which is why we're here today, right? This is also why we're working to ensure we have the appropriate IPLC representation at the heart of our governance framework. And let me share you briefly. On our board of directors, we have recently appointed Francisco Souza, who's managing director of the FSC Indigenous Foundation and member of the Apurinya Indigenous Peoples of the Brazilian Amazon. And we are currently recruiting 2 additional IPLC board members that we will hope also will contribute to further gender balance in our board. In our expert panel and subject matter experts, which are at the heart of creating these standards and are responsible of the CCPs and assessment framework, we have included experts at the level of Francisseymour, which you heard from this morning. On our distinguished advisory group, which provides strategic insight and advice to the board, we are including Hindu and Tuntiak, who you will be hearing from today as well. In this design stage, there are 2 key ways that IPLCs can get involved. One is through dialogue, such as this one, so we can listen and learn from you. The second is to encourage your participation. We will be launching a public consultation once these documents are revised and approved by the board, which will be an important opportunity to respond formally to the draft proposals. At this early stage, therefore, it's critical that we address some of the key challenges the IPLCs face, including, for example, establishing the appropriate environmental and social safeguards, increasing transparency and accountability on how the funds are being used, building on learning from existing mechanisms such as the Nagoya Protocol. We would like to also explore innovations in access and benefit sharing, and understanding how direct access and management could take place. We would also like to build a long-term engagement model that works to ensure future development on the voluntary carbon market. With this, I will finish. I thank you very much for your time and attention. I will hand back to Clea, and very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts and experiences during this discussion.
Thank you, Daniel. That was great. I'm going to move very quickly to Mark because I want to leave enough time for Hindu and Tuntiak to react. I think their voices are essential. So let's move quickly to Mark, and then we're gonna close up with Hindus and Tuntiak's reflections immediately. Thank you, Mark. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Claire, and thank you for the invitation to participate here today. My name is Mark Kember, and I represent the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. And let me start by just saying I echo pretty much everything that Danielle has said before me, not least because I'm a member of his board, but also because integrity end-to-end across the carbon markets is essential, not only for dealing with the rights and state values of IPLC communities, but to make a carbon market that works. So the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative looks at the demand side. If you think of what Danielle just presented, looks at the supply side, the quality of projects, the quality of credits, the quality of how transactions take place, including benefit sharing and other issues. We look at the demand side. So what about the companies that are buying carbon credits? And we seek to answer 2 fundamental questions. One is, when and under what circumstances should companies be engaging in the carbon markets and in voluntary carbon markets in particular in the first place? i.e. what constitutes high integrity use of carbon credits? And the second question we look to answer is, what should companies be allowed to say about that? And as many of you know, companies for the last 2 decades have been making all sorts of enormous and very exciting sounding claims about their climate action, their broader social and environmental activities. Those are rarely consistent, often open to abuse, and often cover up a lot of the malfeasance that has taken place. So the VCMI looked to create a framework, a code of practice for companies wanting to engage with carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets in particular in a way that is high integrity. And Danielle touched on one of the key elements of that high integrity is that use of carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets in particular must be above and beyond government action and corporate decarbonization. It is not a substitute. It is what we need all efforts to reduce, remove, and avoid emissions, but carbon market activities must not come at the cost of government action and decarbonization. So the VCMI will be publishing on June the 7th a draft version of its code of practice, and we will be holding a public consultation in July and August and encourage all of those here to participate on that, and Claire, who works closely with us, will ensure that everybody has information to be able to do so. While the engagement of Indigenous people and local communities in projects is more directly covered by the work that Danielle mentioned, and also obviously Lucia's work, it's essential that the claims that companies make about their use of carbon credits not only reflects genuine emissions reductions, but also reflects at a minimum doing no harm. And in the targeted consultation we've been carrying out in the last 2 to 3 weeks, a very strong emphasis on positive and quantifiable social, economic and environmental benefits as defined by the local communities, including Indigenous peoples, who in theory receive those benefits. And I thought it was very interesting, the question that was put earlier to Isaac about the benefit sharing mechanism. Who defines it? Who decides what the benefits are and how they're received? And that is absolutely essential. And part of the feedback that we've had recently is that companies, and we will put this in the guidance, must be asking where the benefits go and who determines them. Many of you will have seen a recent article, I think in the Financial Times, which looked at the huge difference in prices that brokers were paying for credits, i.e. what is received by the local community and the project owner, and how much they were charging companies to buy those, often a markup of 300, 400, 500, even 900%. And one key to that, and this is not just on the VCMI side, but across the whole of the carbon market, is full transparency on prices, on margins, and on benefits. And only with that transparency can all of us and the wider world know what is happening, who's benefiting, and who's taking the lion's share of the profits. In the VCMI itself, and I'll finish with this, we're delighted that Tuntiak, who you're going to hear from in a moment, is a member of our steering committee. We have asked various members of representatives of Indigenous communities to feed into us a box that will go in our guidance, which is what are the key guardrails or questions that corporates must be asking when they're buying carbon credits in terms of respecting rights, in terms of sharing of benefits, and all other aspects that affect host communities, and obviously in this context, Indigenous peoples. So I will leave it there. I encourage you all to contact me. Claire can provide a conduit, but also participate in our public consultation over the summer. The voluntary carbon market from supply to demand can only have credibility if it attacks every node along that journey, from the moment a project idea comes to the moment a corporate or other actor makes a claim about those carbon credits. So we need finally to all work together to make sure we do have that end-to-end integrity and transparency. Thank you, Claire.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. Now I'm going to turn to Hindu and Tuntiak. I would like you to reflect back on what you have heard. How does it sound? Does the current landscape of standards and initiatives supporting high integrity carbon market is responding to Indigenous people's needs and requests? What recommendations you have? So we are eager to hear what you have to say, starting with Hindu, please. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, dear sister, friends. I'm very happy to be with you here and hearing also all the previous speakers. Let me start by a demand. I think VCMI and IVCMI, both of you need to coordinate, collaborate, work together. If you talk both about transparency, you talk both about Indigenous peoples, you talk both about you wanted to support us and boost us. And if you have like two organizations, I'm not sure that we are having this coordination and this transparency. Match your organization firstly, and then Indigenous peoples, we are the same. Tuntiak is the same, Hindu is the same, and then the rest of our relatives at home, they are the same. There is not just like one land where you can apply the IVCMI and another one, the VCMI. So the two names also are the same. So for us, it will be very helpful to have you together coordinating and have this transparency for all of us and have the implementation. You are very complementary, and at the end, it is the same. So this is really my first reaction to both of you, and then to all the rest of the participants here to follow on this work. We cannot anymore act in silo. It is the same land, it is the same planet. So we need to come together. This really the things you have to do all. We can be in your board, we can be your advice, we can be your partners, but we can also divide ourselves and our brain to just to like hear this one and go back to that one. I love both of you, but you have to love each other first. So this is my first comment and recommendation. Please take that to your board and think about that. But secondly, so to come back to the discussion, we must all ensure that our effort of distribution get the opportunities on the risk equitably. So between all the indigenous communities, I really believe that if we done it correctly, we consider the moral, social, environmental impact, then the voluntary carbon market have a real potential that can drive millions of investment to indigenous peoples to fight climate change and restore biodiversity. But to do that, we need both the policies and the finance support and engagement of indigenous peoples. The policy can be done only by governments, and then the finance can be also done by governments and then by private sectors. We cannot only allow the private sectors or only the government. There is also the need of collaborations, and that can help indigenous peoples to be the lead. We need the private sectors who can also adopt the safeguard on UNDP and FPIC, not only in paper, but in the implementations. We know that many are really open. Yes, we need the UNDP. Yes, we need the FPIC, but no, it is not only the UNDP and FPIC as wording in the document. It is the implementations that we are asking for. And the implementation of both are a process. So process in your own organization as legislations for the government, and then process during the implementation with indigenous peoples, that where we say no, it is no, where we say yes, it is yes, and it is have to be built. All is about our knowledge, our solutions, our way of saving our environment. And we know that it is not only the forests who are capturing the carbon. We know there is land, there is pastures, there are oceans, there are glaciers. So all those important ecosystems, we need to focus on them. If we just to make a safeguard in one ecosystem, we leave the other one, we are giving more opportunity again to harm our lands. Our ecosystems are interconnected. If one of them is harmed, the other one also is harmed immediately. So we need to think about how it can be covering all those various ecosystems who are capturing the carbon. And in all those places, indigenous peoples are living there. So for that, I leave you with three short points. Firstly, there is no pathway to save climate which does not involve or increase much needed finance for nature. So indigenous peoples need those direct access through the government or through also the private sectors. And those supports need to be led by indigenous peoples, not dictated by the private or by government. So we know how to protect our forests. We know also how to manage the rest of the funding. Our way of doing is different, but you have to respect and accept our way of doing, because that's the one who sustains the land. Secondly, so leveraging nature will be one of the key themes at the CBD and climate discussions. And I am really very hopeful that if we work together to implement the offset, that will enable both the public and private sector to partnership on this mitigation and biodiversity restoration. So let us have that as target in those two COPs, and then indigenous peoples can help to leverage it. So we have the opportunities, so we must use those platforms to make it. And finally, so I would like to see the public and private all working together around the commitment they have to turn it into a real cash in the tables. We cannot live on the hope. We wanted to see the cash in the tables to start working in the projects. And we wanted to be as partners, not as beneficiaries or not as recipients. We are partners. And if we are partners, we must have this cash and show to the communities and to the planet that we are starting to restore it. And then we can all talk about VCMI or IVCM as Indigenous peoples and you partners together. Thank you so much. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Hindu. There was a lot in your intervention and a really good reminder on the holistic view of Indigenous peoples. It's not a part, but a sum of the part, and the importance of counting with government actions and the private sector actions that are essential because they have a direct impact on Indigenous territories. And this coordination between the CBD, UNFCCC, and other processes to work together, and of course the recommendations to the colleagues here, all very valuable. Thank you. And I'm going to close with Tuntiak. Keen to hear your reflections. The floor is yours.
Hola, buenas tardes.
Hi, greetings everyone from the Ecuadorian Amazon region. I'm very happy to be here sharing this space with you. It's very important. It's related to life, to climate crisis worldwide, and right. Definitely about right. I'd like to thank you for the invitation and for the presentations that have been made so far.
Diferentes niveles de participación que hemos tenido.
The different levels of participation that have taken place and being very transparent, which is what I've been saying in international spaces previously and within different mechanisms that are being created now, because now it's in to create all these platforms and mechanisms, different solutions. And what do I mean by this? Is that it is very important for Indigenous peoples and local communities have firsthand information, above all, of any process that's being built at a national, international, or regional level. And we need to participate truly in a way that what we have been doing for a very long time be recognized, including the recognition of territorial rights, which means recognizing and supporting the exercise of said rights among those of ecosystem services. Therefore, I'd like to go back to when we started talking about REDD+. Indigenous peoples from the Amazon region said, let's not just talk about REDD+, about the 3 Ds or 2 Ds, plus conservation, plus carbon. No, we said Amazon Indigenous REDD, an idea that goes past just trees, little trees here and there, and just carbon stock. No, I was talking about much broader, including spirituality, the identity of Indigenous peoples as part of this. Therefore, for many years now, many mechanisms have been created to counteract climate change, to counteract the climate crisis that we're currently undergoing. But what I have seen throughout these long years is that set policies, set mechanisms have been created by the government, by different states and private enterprises, but not by Indigenous peoples and local communities. I'm talking, and I'm addressing this from the Amazon region. We have very many forests here, territory that is helping, contributing for many years to counteracting climate crisis. However, at an international level, we have been speaking about many different ways of mitigating, many ways of combating climate change, but we have not been addressing, been talking about truly recognizing those people, those guardians of the forest, the ones that are truly contributing. Right now, at this point, the contributions, the specific contributions by indigenous peoples are not being recognized at an international level, at a government level even, at a national level. So I fully agree with what Hindu mentioned. We have said this in different spaces. We're part of the solution. Therefore, we need to talk as partners. And doing so it requires for indigenous peoples to be involved in the different talks related to climate change and not simply get there as mere observers. We need a space to talk. Same thing with the CBD. We need a dialogue as partners. And partners sit on a table and talk. See, the old way of getting IPs involved and to talk on behalf of indigenous peoples needs to be moved away from. There needs to be a transition in which we're there together with government, private sector, academia, as equal partners. So I've gotten involved in different spaces so that I can understand their language. Because oftentimes, my brothers and sisters at the community that do not understand the different languages, mechanisms, and so forth that are being created. And therefore, what I'm proposing, and what I have been proposing and proposing here, is that us, as indigenous people, don't only want to work on carbon mechanisms or carbon credits, we want to go past that further and talking about mechanisms that help preserve what we have, mechanisms that support us in incrementing and socializing what we have been doing. Therefore, we need to do systematic work to bring real information about these processes, about financing, about policies, and for that information to reach the community so that the communities have all the needed information to make a decision and for them to decide whether to move forward or not. We need to lead a transition of institutional arrangements so that indigenous peoples and local communities push for their own projects based on their self-determination, their own cosmovision within their territories. One component that is also missing. So as I mentioned, the mechanisms have not been created by and for indigenous peoples, but we're asking to be part of them. And again, to be part of those mechanisms that have been created by others. That's one thing, but we're not just asking for that. What we're asking, in addition, is for mechanisms that are specific, direct financing mechanisms be created that, again, that are created by and for indigenous peoples with land titling, the full implementation of land tenure right by indigenous peoples, and for territorial restoration to take place. Restoration of the territories. Again, I'm talking about rights of indigenous peoples to their territories. And of course, to generate and support initiatives of the biocircular indigenous economy, a holistic one, one with indigenous identity, one that doesn't address climate change only, but one that truly creates or incorporates the entire context of human life. Again, going back to the protection of the rights and inclusion of the rights of people in nature. So it's not just about indigenous problems, forest problems, ecosystem problems. We need to address a problem of humanity, indigenous and non-indigenous. Therefore, I propose, and I will continue proposing in the different spaces, that all these mechanisms should truly secure the points that I've mentioned before. So I invite you all, scientists, scholars, businesses, governments, to sit together and discuss about the real problem about life, about the protection of the planet. And to those governments that are making decisions, making economic policies, if you truly want to reduce activities that hurt the planet and increase the ones that benefit it, if you truly want to keep resources underground, or fossil resources, ones that are destroying our planet, and you want to strengthen traditional knowledge and practices of people that have been contributing and continue contributing to global health. So let's talk about this from a life principle base. And to our partners in ICVCM, let's go past carbons. Let's talk about the entire ecosystem, the entire context within the territories: water, mountain, rivers, cascades, lagoons, deserts, glaciers, among other ecosystems. The exercise we're doing here today, it's an opportunity. Again, it's just an exercise, and it's nice that different actors have been convened here. But we need a space to continue discussing this, because the answer is not going to come from any one sector specifically, but all sectors at once. Thank you all very much. Once again, Tuntekatan greets you all. Thank you.
Tuntiak. Thank you very much, Tuntiak, for those very important remarks and reminding us that colonialism is long gone. We need to have a horizontal relationship with indigenous peoples, non-paternalistic approaches, and work together as partners in this very important battle that we have ahead. And also, perhaps I take on your message on that carbon market initiatives need to be part of a much larger solution. You know, they're no silver bullet, and they need to perhaps adapt to really fit into the cosmovision of indigenous peoples and their landscape that is, of course, much more complex and requires many more other complementary initiatives. With this, I'm going to close this panel. Thank you very much to all. I think we have enough material for another event, so we're going to look for opportunities to organize a second event where we could go deeper into the issues that we only touched briefly today. My colleague Nina is going to moderate a very short Q&A session because we ran out of time and we have to close the webinar. Thank you very much to all.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you so much for the panelists. Incredibly rich content. There's so many great questions. I'm inviting the panelists to respond in writing in the Q&A chat, but I wanted to ask this question that comes from Steve Nita. Huge parts of the world don't qualify for participating in the market due to the additionality issues, yet the impact of climate change is real. Do you see a time in the future when climate change impacts qualify these areas in participating in the carbon market? I wanted to invite, I believe, Lucia wanted to take that question. Yes, thank you. Please go ahead.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. Taking into account
Zonas del planeta,
that in other areas of the planet, many of them protected now for many years by indigenous peoples,
consideramos que Por supuesto,
At
sí,
art, we believe that yes, they face a challenge even though they're being protected, and that in the past they have not seen high rates of deforestation. They're under constant risk due to the constant advances of threats into their territories. Therefore, we have created a level of accreditation for high forest coverage and low deforestation. That level of accreditation allows those regions to participate and to generate credits on the reduction of immigration due to reduced emissions. So therefore of high levels, high quality, so they can participate in the markets. So the question now is that since today we have the option, and we believe that it's one of the main options that allow indigenous peoples that have been protecting their forests to participate in this market.
Great, thank you so much. I also wanted to address one other, I know there's, I'm asking Danielle and Mark to please put in your inputs and additional comments on this question in the chat. I wanted to give the floor to Isaac Bryson to respond to this question that had come in early on. If you can tell us a little more about the benefit sharing mechanism of the project, how many stakeholders included in the mechanism, and whether the benefits distributed are in the form of monetary or also include non-monetary. So a little bit, and then we'll go to the closing remarks by Leticia Guimaraes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you much once again. Going directly to the question that about benefit sharing mechanism in the community, that the community have been involved in benefit sharing mechanisms through the participatory meetings, where they can decide, where they can recognize their challenges, their daily challenges, their daily life challenges, or any issues, and they go through planning and making their budgets, and then they go through implementing those planning and the budgets of their own issues for some times. Then when they are ready, they use to come together to share the report and to evaluate all the issues so that they use to proceed for the next steps. So this is done through the participatory meetings. And the benefit we are talking about is the benefit that in form of monetary issues and non-monetary. I can go direct to elaborate a little bit about non-monetary benefits. Non-monetary benefits that are well recognized by the community of the Yada-Yasi is that the Yada-Yasi community, most of them are hunter-gatherers, Hazabe, and the others are the Piwa local pastoralists, that is Datoga. So through conservation effort through this project, it means the natural environment are well improving and lead to the availability of the grazing pasture that is used by the animals, livestock, and also wildlife. That is very important food for the Hazabe because they use meat and other natural resources like roots and fruits. So conserving the such environment through this project, it helped them to have an access to this such kind of natural resources that is very important to sustain their life. While grazing also is very supported to this pastoral society. So for the monetary issue, they used to make budget and the planning for the challenges that they face. And after that, they go directly to solve or to implement and helping the community, especially the programs that they used to run is like healthy, education, monitoring issues of the project, fighting for anti-poaching programs, and all other recognized issues that can be put into monetary implementation. And I can add that other non-monetary benefit is like now, because they have a joint conservation effort through this project. So it has bring a good climatic condition, a localized climatic condition that has been interested or have been benefited to the whole people around the Yaida-Eyasi Valley. And we have a number of stakeholders who have been cooperating with community of the Yaida-Eyasi, including our government leaders at the level of the ward and district, and also other stakeholders such as UCRT, Ujamaa Community Resource, is one of the organizations that help the community to implement the land planning issues and boundary issues, security, and so many other issues. So I'm happy that this project is bringing supportive mechanisms, and the people are sharing the benefit in the ways as I have said. And I'm here to use the opportunity to invite the people to support us so that we can proceed well in this important project for our life. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Isaac, for your input and for your response and for your participation. I see that there's more information on your project in the chat. There's incredible questions. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for your questions, for your attention and participation. We will organize more of these events. Clearly there's a need and demand. I wanted to pass the floor now for closing remarks and wrap up by Leticia Guimaraes, our Senior Global Technical Advisor at the Climate and Forest Program. Leticia, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina, and thank you to all the panelists and organizers today. This was such a rich discussion, as it was mentioned by everyone. I think we really need to do more of this and have more moments to hear more the voices from Indigenous peoples. I'm very excited to continue our efforts in UNDP to maintain and create these spaces and support Indigenous peoples' direct engagement on carbon markets design and also the implementation of these mechanisms. I will share with you 4 key points that I extracted from everything that I heard today, and I'm sure everyone has their own points. But just so some of these key points are mentioned, the first one is that everyone agrees on the importance of Indigenous peoples as the most effective forest stewards and the need to recognize through financial incentives this great contribution that they're making in terms of protecting the forest. This recognition is not only through carbon markets resources, but all types of finance, as it was mentioned before. The second point relates to the direct access of Indigenous peoples to resources and their active engagement in the design as well, not only the implementation of carbon market mechanisms. Hindu and Tuntak have mentioned this point a few times, that there is a need for an engagement from the beginning, from the design, and for that financial support will be needed in order to enable participation of the various Indigenous peoples. It's important also that standards and countries that are implementing carbon market initiatives take their time to undertake consultations. These are processes that usually take a lot of time and build upon the existing initiatives and governance structures, as it was mentioned by Chief Amir. The third lesson is about the integrity of carbon markets, that this is an important issue and that it goes above and beyond the technical issues of accounting and MRV, and it's directly related to the implementation of safeguards Jean has mentioned the importance of having international criteria and recognizing that in some contexts, national legislations are not as effective in terms of recognizing Indigenous people's rights. And Amir also mentioned the importance of respecting Indigenous peoples on governance structures and decision-making processes. The fourth and final point is that this is a new momentum for carbon markets. Glasgow decisions, as it was mentioned by Kim, are an important landmark. There is increasing demand from the private sector for voluntary carbon markets credits. There is also a transition from project level implementation to jurisdictional implementation, which is something that addresses the point by Amir on the issue of projects not being capable of dealing with the problem on their own, that the political context is key. And we have a lot of lessons to learn from these projects in order to move towards the jurisdictional implementation. Finally, I would like to invite you all to take these key points and come up with other points on challenges to discuss with your organization and your own stakeholders, to write to us. These are my contacts and Nina's contacts. If you have any issues, if you see this event as being useful, we are going to put a poll here to hear from you about this event. If you found it useful, what are the other areas potentially that you would like to learn more? And thank everyone again for your active participation on the event today. This is the first of many that we are looking forward to do. Thank you so much for your participation today. Thank you.
Thank you, Leticia. This wraps up our event, a very rich discussion. I'm grateful to every one of you for being here, participating, for all the panelists, all my colleagues, every audience member who was here participated. Thank you so much for the interpreters as well for your great work. We're here, our contacts are here. We welcome you to get in touch. Let's stay connected to continue this important work, and we'll see you in future events. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating. I'll leave this open for another minute so we get more responses of the survey, and thank you for that.
A special thank you for the people that connected from their communities,
Yes.
Las mujeres quichua del Ecuador, toda la gente que se ha conectado de sus comunidades. Muchos saludos a sus comunidades y gracias.
To everyone, thank you very much to everyone to connected from the communities, to the Indigenous women connected today, Indigenous peoples from Colombia, also at your community, to all of you. Thank you all very much.